Good afternoon. This is Kim McCleary. I'm President and CEO of the CFS Association of America, and I'm delighted to be with this large international audience this afternoon for an exciting program titled CFS The Viral Connection with our guest speaker, Dr. Anthony Komaroff. And before I introduce Dr. Komaroff, I just want to take a minute or two to go through some kind of housekeeping things, which will be routine for about 2/3 of our audience who have participated in past webinars with us. But just as a reminder, and also for those who are taking part in their first webinar today, as is the case for Dr. Komaroff actually. So this is our 14th program of the 2010 series. I'm pleased to say it is our most widely pre-registered program. We had about 640 people pre-register just before I signed on. That was the number, and so usually a few more people join before the actual starting time, and then we have about 60% of people who pre-register actually participate. As a reminder to those who haven't participated in one of these in a little while or maybe ever, Dr. Komaroff and I are actually in different locations. So we're all seeing, hopefully, PowerPoint slides on your computer screen, but Dr. Komaroff can't see me. I can't see him. He can't see any of you, and you can't see us. So it's a bit of a blind box that we sit in while we do these. So bear with us as we sort of talk to one another about switching controls and things like that. We don't have the benefit of body language or hand signals to use. In the registration process, there was an opportunity for people to submit questions, and we got many, many questions in advance, and I've shared those with Dr. Komaroff, and we sort of prioritized some of those, but you do have the opportunity as we're going through to send questions through the control panel that's on the right side of your screen. There is a little dialog box where you can type questions. Those will actually come into me, and I will sort through those and compile them with the ones we've already received, and then after Dr. Komaroff finishes his presentation, his slides, we'll go to the Q&A session and just kind of have a dialogue. We are recording today's program, and both the recording and the slides will be posted online within a day or two. Sometimes we're luckier than others, and the processing time happens quickly, and we're able to get that up by the end of the day, but just in case, give us a day or two to get that sorted for you. And the word is one that we give at the beginning of each one of these. Although Dr. Komaroff is an MD, a medical doctor, he's not able, through this presentation method, to address individuals' questions about their symptoms, test results, or therapy. So we'd appreciate it if you not pose questions of a personal nature that would be better to discuss with your own healthcare professional. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today. His formal titles are the Simcox Clifford Higbee Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Komaroff also serves as Editor-in-Chief of Harvard Health Publications at Harvard Medical School, and he is a Senior Physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And as I said, those are his formal titles, but I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative to give a more personal introduction. As I was preparing for this program this morning, I was thinking of how fortunate we are as a community to have this man working for us as a dedicated physician and researcher in the field, and how we're also fortunate for his service as an unofficial ambassador for the cause within many communities which he regularly interfaces with, medicine, science, academia, publishing, and so on. And I'm reminded of how much he has enriched the association's work over these years and how he has shaped my own journey of service to the community. Dr. Komaroff and I have stood together at conferences from Seattle to Cold Spring Harbor, New York, from Los Angeles to Barcelona, and many places in between. I've had the privilege of trading turns with him at a podium at the U.S. Capitol building and the National Press Club. He allowed us to send his portrait, one similar to the one you're looking at, to more than 36 public venues where nearly 7 million people viewed Faces of CFS exhibit. And he's responded to scores of media requests we've sent to him for media interviews. We've served together on the CFS Coordinating Committee, CDC reviews, and other advisory groups. He's been a teacher, an advocate, a sounding board, an advisor, and a mentor to me and many, many others. He has made immeasurable contributions to the scientific literature, to patient care, and to the credibility of CFS. And it is my absolute honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Komaroff to our large international webinar audience today. Dr. Komaroff?
Kim, thank you for all of those kind words. If my mother were here, still alive, and she heard your words, she would believe them. My father might have been something different, but in any event, it's my pleasure to talk today. Are my slides visible, Kim?
I am trying to accomplish that right now. Let's see.
Okay.
You should have a dialog box in a second. Here we go. So the audience is back to the waiting room, and if you'll click Show My Screen, I think everybody will be able to see your slides.
Okay, just did it.
Very good. There they are.
Good. And now everyone is on and can hear me and see my slides?
I hope so. Usually I get a bunch of messages if there's a problem with the audio, so I'm going to hope that that is not the case today, and nobody's banging on my door from other offices within our office. So I think we're in good shape.
Good.
You're all set.
Good. Well, let me go forward. Whoops. Well, the slide advance doesn't seem to be working.
If you'll click, use the mouse to click on the screen, and then it should work. Just point your mouse to your slides, and then it should advance.
Just clicking the mouse on the screen.
Yep. Kind of activates the controls.
Okay. Good. Well, worked for the first one. What I thought I would do today, I know that there's a lot of interest about the role of viruses in CFS, and I'm going to spend most of the time on that, but I wanted to give a little perspective because while the virus issue is a very important one and the role of viruses in this illness is a very important one, there's also a lot of other science that has nothing to do with viruses that I just wanted to highlight some of the things that 25 years of science, 5,000 scientific articles in many prestigious journals are telling us about the underlying biology of chronic fatigue syndrome. First, let's talk about the severity of this illness. I think we all probably agree that the name chronic fatigue syndrome is terrible in many ways, and one of the most important reasons it's terrible is that it seems to trivialize the kind of suffering that this illness causes. Because, of course, every human being experiences fatigue, and so when they hear that there is an illness called chronic fatigue syndrome, they assume it's not a serious, disabling condition. But nothing could be less true. There is an instrument used to measure personal function, and the details of this instrument don't matter, but see that array of lines. The lines represent scores on 8 different scales of function. And the yellow line at the top represents the average scores for the average healthy member of the population, adult member of the population. The red line represents the average scores for people with heart failure, which, as you can see, is lower. And the lower these lines go, the worse the level of function is. The blue line represents the average person with major depression, and the white line represents people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And on most of the scales, except the scales that involve emotional and mental health functioning, the CFS patients on the physical functioning scales score lower, than the other groups. There's also a lot of lost productivity from chronic fatigue syndrome. This is a study that was done by a random digit dialing of 56,000 persons that found that CFS patients have a substantial decline in their household productivity, their ability to do the things that are essential around the home, and a 54% reduction in labor force productivity. And this study estimated that the total cost to the United States each year from just lost productivity caused by this illness is over $9 billion. And that doesn't even include the costs of medical care for this illness. The $9 billion is a lot of money. It's about the bottom line of the biggest company in the world, Walmart. So it's a big problem. The main issues I want to address today are these. Are there objective biological markers that are abnormal in chronic fatigue syndrome? That's a very important question and a very fair question, because the syndrome is defined, as you know, by a group of symptoms. And symptoms are subjective. Anyone can say they have a symptom, and there's no objective way of verifying that a person has a symptom. So what doctors and biological scientists want to know about this illness is, even if it's defined by a bunch of symptoms, can you find objective evidence that there's something wrong biologically in people with this illness? And I think the answer to that these days, in 2010, is unequivocally yes. Do we understand how the CFS symptoms are caused? No. Caused by these underlying biological abnormalities? No. There are theories, many good theories, but I think there we really don't understand that important question. How is the body affected by chronic fatigue syndrome? In my judgment, the research literature shows pretty clearly that there are abnormalities of the brain, also called the central nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system, which is that part of the nervous system that controls vital bodily functions like blood pressure, pulse rate, body temperature, etc. The immune system is also acting abnormally in this illness. In particular, many arms of the immune system seem to be chronically activated, as if they're engaged in some chronic war against something that the immune system regards as foreign inside the body. There is, in the last 5 to 10 years, growing evidence that the cells of the body have trouble making enough energy. When I first heard someone say that this illness that feels to the human being with it as if it's a lack of energy, is actually caused by a lack of the ability of the cells in the body to make enough energy, I thought that was a very simplistic idea and probably not true. But I was wrong. I think there's now abundant evidence that energy metabolism is affected, and that the little energizer bunnies inside each cell, the mitochondria, that make energy for the cell, that the mitochondria are affected by this illness. Finally, we'll talk briefly about genetic studies, and then lastly come to what are we learning about the role of different infectious agents. Start with the brain. Summarize a huge literature, 1,000 articles at least. The hormones that the brain makes, and those hormones then leave the brain and travel to other parts of the body and affect other hormone-producing glands in the body, like the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland. That there are multiple abnormalities of the hormones that are made in the brain. And several of those abnormalities are in the exact opposite direction from what is seen in people with major depression. Various studies of thinking, of cognition, have generally agreed that there is an impairment in information processing speed in people with this illness, and some impairment in memory, particularly short-term memory and attention, and that this is not explained by any psychiatric disorders that the persons might have. The autonomic nervous system has been shown to be impaired in anywhere from 30 to 80% of the patients in different studies. Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, is a way of taking a picture of the brain, and MRI abnormalities, in particular little areas of very high signal in what is called the white matter of the brain, are seen more often in people with chronic fatigue syndrome than in healthy individuals or individuals with major depression or other comparative illnesses. Another way of taking a picture of the brain is called SPECT scanning, and here too there have been many papers that report abnormalities in chronic fatigue syndrome. Let me emphasize that these abnormalities on MRI scan and SPECT scan that I've been talking about are not permanent damage. They are things that come and go, an active process that's not right in the brain, but not a permanent injury to the brain. And then finally, brainwave studies, or EEG, electroencephalogram studies, have shown increased numbers of waves that are called sharp waves or spike waves, and a fairly recent technique for reading EEG signals called spectral coherence in studies by our colleagues here at Harvard have shown very strong differences between people with chronic fatigue syndrome, major depression, and healthy controls. One way of assessing whether there's something going on in the brain is to measure chemicals that are present in the brain as those chemicals are reflected in the spinal fluid. The spinal fluid is fluid that coats the brain and the spinal cord. And one way, since it's very hard to measure what's going directly in the brain, since the brain is inside the head, inside a very bony skull, one fairly simple way of studying what's going on in the brain is to measure spinal fluid. And a technique called mass spectroscopy is the gold standard technique for measuring proteins in any kind of fluid. And that technique, the details of the slide don't matter, that technique shows that in chronic fatigue syndrome, you can find a bunch of proteins that are not present in healthy control subjects, a very significant difference statistically. And what these proteins are involved in is repairing injury to any tissue, in this case, the brain. Whoops. Let's see if there's a way of getting back. I guess there's not. This is a study. It has not yet been replicated by other scientists, but I think it's a very provocative study. It's a complicated slide, but the message that it will be giving in a minute is not complicated at all. On the right side of this slide, you see a group of colored squares that each of which represents a molecule, a group of molecules that are involved in the brain sensing pain and temperature and touch and other sensations, a group of molecules involved in the autonomic nervous system, the adrenaline response, and a group of molecules involved in the immune system and the immune response. And as many of you know, one of the features of chronic fatigue syndrome is that people often report that exercise even mild exercise for a fairly brief period of time, while it may feel fine while you're doing it, causes the next day, 12 to 48 hours after the exercise, a flare-up of the underlying illness, CFS, and a flare-up of many of the symptoms of the illness. So these investigators at the University of Utah put healthy, normal people through an exercise test and measured all of these molecules at different time points. Here at baseline, before the test began, before the exercise began, 30 minutes later, 8 hours later, 24 hours later, 48 hours later. And as you can see, there are a few of these molecules that bumped up a little bit after the exercise compared with before the exercise. What would you see in people with chronic fatigue syndrome put through exactly the same exercise challenge? As you can see, a very striking difference in what happens following exercise with virtually all of these molecules. They're produced by circulating white blood cells in at much higher levels than in healthy people. So how that translates into the symptoms that people experience following exercise, we don't fully understand at this point. But it and many other studies of different molecules following exercise say, yes, this is a clear biological difference, and yes, it could explain, even though we haven't proved that it does, the symptoms of feeling much worse following exercise. What about the immune system? This is a huge literature, and I'm only going to just touch on a few of what seem to me the most solidly established findings. A group of white blood cells called cytotoxic CD8 cells that are very important in fighting viral infections are clearly activated, which means you can tell whether an immune system cell is at rest or activated by certain molecules that appear on the surface of the cell. These patients with chronic fatigue syndrome are much more likely than healthy control subjects to have the cytotoxic T cells in an activated state. Another kind of white blood cell is called natural killer cell, and it too is very important in containing viral infections. These cells appear to be functioning quite poorly in most patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Whether they're functioning poorly because they're just exhausted from fighting a chronic battle, or whether there's something about them genetically that makes them ill-prepared to handle viral infections is unknown. There is a system within lymphocytes called the 2,5-A system. It's a system of molecules, a cascade of molecules that helps fight against certain kinds of viral infection. This system is turned on in chronic fatigue syndrome. And then finally, the molecules that immune system cells make to orchestrate the immune attack against something foreign, which are called cytokines, those molecules, particularly the type called pro-inflammatory cytokines, are increased, or most studies show are produced in increased amounts by circulating white blood cells. So all of these things together say that the immune system appears to be chronically activated, and parts of it may be starting to fail, like the natural killer cells, because they've been fighting so hard for so long, and they still see an enemy there that they're trying to contain. What about energy metabolism and two kinds of stress, metabolic stress or molecular stress, called oxidative and nitrosative stress, and inflammation? We know about those things in chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is the the hypothesis that I mentioned a few minutes ago. If an organism, like a human organism, experiences a lack of energy, perhaps there's a defect in energy metabolism at the cellular level. That was the hypothesis that I thought was pretty simplistic, but which I think is turning out to be true. This is a complicated slide, and the details don't matter. But in biology, these two kinds of stress, oxidative stress and nitrosative stress, are both triggered by these molecules on the left. And when you have increased oxidative stress or nitrosative stress, it damages certain parts of the cell, including parts of the mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles inside a cell. And every element, there are studies, many studies, that show that every element in this slide is up or down. That is, these molecules are all up in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, and there is increased oxidative stress as reflected by these ways of measuring oxidative stress. Same thing with nitrosative stress. The details don't matter. What matters is there's now lots of evidence looking at this interconnected set of molecules that say something is different in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome than in healthy people. One of the things that happens when the mitochondria are not working well is that a second kind of metabolism called anaerobic metabolism is increased, and that leads to increased production of a molecule called lactate. And I'm saying this, I'm pointing out this detail because I'm about to show you some data in patients with chronic syndrome. Here is a measurement again of the molecule lactate in spinal fluid in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome here on the left, patients with anxiety, and healthy individuals. And just published, but not shown on this slide, patients with depression. And the patients with depression are like the patients with anxiety and the healthy people. They're down here. Chronic fatigue syndrome patients are up here. A very clear difference. So something is producing increased anaerobic metabolism in chronic fatigue syndrome patients. What that something might be is, at this point, purely hypothetical. But here's what we know about that and about the forces that in biology tend to cause increased amounts of oxidative stress and nitrosative stress. And other than people who are, some people, it's pretty rare, are born with a genetic condition that makes them more vulnerable to oxidative and nitrosative stress. But for people other than that, for most of us, viral infections and the inflammatory response to viral infections are very common causes of oxidative stress, nitrosative stress, and mitochondrial malfunction. Some examples of viral infections that cause these kinds of stress inside cells, and in particular inside the cells of the brain, are listed here. Several of them have never been shown to have any connection to chronic fatigue syndrome and don't. In fact, I would say none of them have been convincingly shown to have, none of them have been shown, the top four, to have any connection to chronic fatigue syndrome. There is a very controversial literature about this fifth one called Borna virus. And then finally, in rats, but not in humans, murine leukemia viruses also have been shown in rats to cause these kinds of stresses in cells of the brain. We'll come back to that in a minute. Genetic studies in chronic fatigue syndrome. Genetic studies, at least as I think about them, can be really put in two different classes. Studies of how genes are built and studies of whether genes are turned on or off in a particular type of cell. How a gene is built influences the protein that the gene makes, and that in turn can have very profound influences on the human being. For example, the disease sickle cell anemia is a disease in which a tiny, tiny change in the gene for a protein called globin makes a tiny change in the protein, and that tiny change causes a terrible disease that produces lots of suffering in people, unfortunately, beginning in most cases in childhood. What do we know about different ways that genes are built in chronic fatigue syndrome patients? In other words, genetic conditions that may be inherited from a parent. There is a way of looking at genetic inheritance called HLA testing. It's a group of molecules that allow you to say things about genetic inheritance. And there are differences in certain of these HLA molecules in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome compared with healthy controls. Studies of twins, both identical twins and fraternal twins, allow you to do estimates as to how much of a condition is due to heredity. And studies done primarily by my colleague Dr. Deidre Buchwald in the University of Washington in Seattle have estimated that a pretty high amount of heritability or a genetic influence in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. And then finally, some studies done by the CDC have identified a few specific gene variants that are associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. I think this whole field of the genetic underpinnings of chronic fatigue syndrome is really in its infancy, and it's likely that many more such variants, gene variants, will be identified. A different way of doing genetic studies, as I said a minute ago, is figuring out which genes are turned on and off in a cell. That was something that was a pipe dream, even 15 or 20 years ago. The idea that we would, well, when I was a medical student, that we would know what all of the genes were inside human cells, let alone know whether in any particular cell each gene was turned on or off, that was a pipe dream. I never thought I would see that in our lifetime. And in fact, it's now a very common way of studying biological phenomena. And basically, studies of this type have found that genes that produce proteins that are involved in immune activation, in energy metabolism, and brain hormones, neurohormones that are involved in the stress response are activated more often in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. So what about infections? Let me step back and make a few sort of general comments about infections and illness, and make a very important general comment about chronic fatigue syndrome. At this point, I don't think that any infectious agent has been proved to be the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. Proved. But I think there's a lot of evidence that infectious agents may very well trigger and even perpetuate chronic fatigue syndrome, if not in every patient with this illness, in many. So, general comments about infections. Most infections that we think of when we think of an infection like the common cold, fortunately, are infections that come and go. Not only do the symptoms come and go, but the symptoms go because the immune system is able to totally wipe out the virus or the bacteria or the other infectious agent that is causing the symptoms. But some infections come and stay. The immune system can never eradicate them completely, although it can keep them down. It can keep them suppressed most of the time with occasional flare-ups. And a common example of that are cold sores caused by herpes simplex virus. Herpes simplex virus is a virus the immune system cannot completely eradicate from the body. None of the herpes viruses can be completely eradicated from the body, but it can keep them suppressed, but now and then they flare up in many people and cause cold sores. Another general concept that infections and syndromes caused by infections, while sometimes they're linked tightly, where one particular virus, for example, causes a particular kind of illness, like the rubella virus caused German measles. But many infectious syndromes are caused by multiple different microbes. So, for example, the common cold, which is caused by hundreds of different viruses, or hepatitis, inflammation of the liver, which can be caused by many different viruses, or gastroenteritis, or bronchitis. You could go on and on. Many infectious syndromes are not caused just by a single type of infectious agent, but are caused by many different types. One concept. Second concept, some diseases may require the interaction of more than one microbe. You may have one virus that's absolutely necessary, but not sufficient to cause an illness. But if there's a second virus there too, you get the illness. A good example of that is a condition called Kaposi's sarcoma that occurs fairly often in AIDS patients, but it also can occur in patients who do not have AIDS. And Kaposi's sarcoma in AIDS patients needs both HIV, the virus that's next, and a second virus, a herpes virus, herpes 8. If you have both of those things, then the condition Kaposi's sarcoma appears. If you don't have that herpes virus, you only have the HIV, Kaposi's sarcoma doesn't occur. So when I first began talking about infectious agents and chronic fatigue syndrome, which was in the mid to late 1980s, I said the following things. This is a copy of a slide that I dug up from 20 years ago. Infectious agents probably can trigger and perpetuate chronic fatigue syndrome. They can't be fully eradicated by the immune system. That is, the agents that prove to be triggers someday, I predicted, would all share one common. They couldn't be fully eradicated by the immune system. Third, that there's evidence that chronic fatigue syndrome can follow a new infection. And then fourth, it's possible that in chronic fatigue syndrome, different infectious agents interact to cause symptoms. So that was what I said a long time ago. We'll come back to what I would say today in a little bit. Which infectious agents have been linked to chronic fatigue syndrome? In my view, these are the agents that have been, for which there's the best evidence that they're able to trigger or perpetuate or both this illness. The first is Epstein-Barr virus. Problem here is that this virus is a ubiquitous virus, meaning that most humans are infected with it, and it's a lifetime infection like all of the herpes viruses. It is a kind of herpes virus. Q fever, which is a bacterial infection in areas of the world that have the bacteria that causes it, can can trigger chronic fatigue syndrome. Ross River virus, a virus that to my knowledge exists in Australia and maybe somewhere else in the southern hemisphere, but not, I don't believe, in the United States. The bacterium that causes Lyme disease. There are clearly documented cases of Lyme disease where the Lyme disease itself gets better with antibiotics, but the people are left with chronic fatigue syndrome. Why that is still a big mystery. Another virus called Parvovirus. I think there's pretty good evidence that in some cases of infection with this virus, particularly Parvovirus B19, chronic fatigue syndrome can follow the acute infection. enteroviruses, which are a family of viruses. I think there's pretty good evidence, although most of it comes from just one laboratory, that these viruses may be triggers of chronic fatigue syndrome. Human herpes virus 6, a herpes virus that was discovered about 25 years ago, and in my judgment has been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome in a number of studies. It's one that we've studied, and so I have greater interest in it. And then finally, the new kid on the block, the virus called xenotropic murine leukemia-related virus, or XMRV for short, and another family of mouse or murine leukemia retroviruses may be triggers of chronic fatigue syndrome. That's, at the moment, as I'll get to in a second, a hotly contested area where I think we frankly don't have all of the answers in yet. What about human herpes virus 6? Let me just spend a minute on that, since I do believe there's a lot of reasons to believe it could be playing a role in some people with chronic fatigue syndrome. We know that it is able to infect many of the cells in the brain. We know that it is able to cause seizures in children. We know that after children are infected with this virus, it persists in the CNS, the central nervous system or brain, for a long time afterwards, maybe always. And that it can cause inflammation of the brain or encephalitis in patients who are immunosuppressed, but also in people who are whose immune systems are perfectly fine. That it can cause demyelination, which is a condition seen in a number of different neurologic diseases, the best known of which is multiple sclerosis. And it can do this in immunosuppressed, but also in infants and children whose immune systems appear to be perfectly healthy. It has been associated with multiple sclerosis, as has another herpes virus, Epstein-Barr virus, but that doesn't mean that a causal connection has been proved. And then finally, in fairly recent studies, human herpes virus 6 has been associated with seizures in the temporal lobes of the brain. And that's interesting because people with those seizures have some of the same brainwave abnormalities that I described a moment ago are seen in chronic fatigue syndrome. Most of the studies of active HV6 or human herpes virus 6 infection in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome have shown an associated active infection and the syndrome. There are some studies that not, but that's true of most topics in medicine. Not every single study comes to the same conclusion, and so what you look for is the preponderance of evidence. Where do most of the studies point? And in the case of this slide, in those studies that do find an association, how many patients were involved in those studies compared with the studies where no association was found? And in this case, the preponderance of the evidence is that active HHV6 infection is found more often in people with chronic fatigue syndrome than in healthy control subjects. What about XMRV, this newly described retrovirus? This is an electron microscopic picture of the virus as appeared in the paper that was published last October in the journal Science by Lombardi and colleagues that really it caused a resurgence of interest in retroviruses in chronic fatigue syndrome. We and others in the 1980s and 90s have looked for lots of different retroviruses that are known to cause infections in humans and had not found any connection between the then known human retroviruses and chronic fatigue syndrome. And so that idea sort of was dropped by many people, certainly including us, until the publication of this study from Lombardi and colleagues last October. What about this virus, XMRV? This is a virus that was originally a virus that could only infect mice, and then underwent mutations that allowed it to infect humans and other species, but it no longer is able actually to infect mice. It is one of several families of what are called mouse or murine leukemia viruses, which I'll abbreviate as MLVs. Another family of MLVs are the polytropic MLVs. These viruses still can infect mice, unlike XMRV, but have also been discovered in recent years to be able to infect other species besides mice. They have not been until very recently suggested to be able to infect humans. How do you look for viruses? There are many ways of looking for viruses. One way is called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. This is basically a technique for finding a needle in a haystack, specifically for finding very small amounts of nucleic acid in a tissue. Nucleic acid is basically the genes of a virus. The nucleic acid of a virus inside white blood cells is usually present in tiny amounts. So it's like finding a needle in a haystack, trying to find in millions of human white blood cells a little bit of virus, a little bit of the virus's nucleic acid. That was an impossible task until recent years, when this technique of PCR has become available. Now, PCR is a powerful technology, powerful enough to be honored with the Nobel Prize, but it's not perfect. It can give falsely negative results. It can give falsely positive results. It's very tricky, and subtle changes in the way that a laboratory does a PCR test can produce quite different results. So many papers that use PCR turn out to report results that are not quite right, or sometimes just frankly wrong. So what did this group, Lombardi and his colleagues, report last October? They used PCR, the technique I've just described, to look for viral nucleic acid, and they found it in 67% of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, but a very small number, 4%, of healthy controls. They also, however, looked for this virus in several other ways. They looked for not the nucleic acid of the virus, but the protein made by the virus, and found that more often in CFS patients than in healthy controls. They actually looked for the virus itself in the cells of white blood cells in the blood and in floating freely in the blood outside the cells. And they found it, these were very small studies, small numbers of patients studied, much more often in the patients with CFS than in the healthy controls. And finally, if a person is infected with a virus, really infected with a virus, usually the immune system of that person makes antibodies against the virus to try to fight it. So if you think you're finding the virus nucleic acid in a person with an illness like CFS, to make yourself believe that, yeah, really the virus is there because the immune system is acting like it's there, you look for antibodies to the virus in the serum. And they found antibodies much more often in the CFS patients than the controls. Now, mind you, if you just look at the total number of people studied, the PCR tests up here on the top row were involved. These other three types of studies were really small numbers of patients, not the same patients. So the most robust finding in that was the PCR finding, and that is the finding that many other laboratories have tried to see if they could produce. Unfortunately, several laboratories, 4 now this week, 5, from around the world have not been able to find by PCR evidence of XMRV in the white cells of people or in the plasma of people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Several weeks ago, I was a co-author on a paper that reported research really done in the laboratory of Dr. Xiqing Lo at the Food and Drug Administration and many of his colleagues, along with Richard Wang and Harvey Alter at the NIH. This study, I'll summarize the results of right now. Using only PCR, we didn't do any of those other kinds of studies to look for the virus. We found that in healthy control subjects, there were about 7% positives, but in chronic fatigue syndrome patients, there were 86, 87% positives. So our results, looking at a broader family of murine leukemia viruses, were rather similar to the PCR results of Lombardi, but with one important difference, which is the viruses we found typically were not XMRV, but their cousins, the polytropic MLVs. Now, we didn't study a lot of people here. We studied 37 patients with this illness. And so the question really is XMRV what would it have been there now and then if we had studied more people? And I think the answer could very well be yes. If I had to bet, I would bet that both XMRV and its cousin, the polytropic MLVs, are found in some patients with this illness. What fraction remains to be determined. But this was a significant difference. The other thing that we did in this study was we retested 4 patients 2 years after their first test, and we retested 8 patients 15 years after their first test. And in almost every instance, the patients remained positive by the test. That is important because contamination in the laboratory is one thing that can give you a falsely positive result on PCR testing. And these specimens were all handled at different times and tested in laboratories that took extreme precautions to guard against contamination. So, but having said that, I think that any scientist has to step back and look at what the literature says about a controversial question. And as I said a while ago, the literature rarely is it that every single paper comes down on the same side of an issue. But often, over time, a preponderance of evidence favors one side versus the other. Right now, though, I don't think we have a preponderance of evidence. We have several papers from very good groups that say they cannot find evidence of these viruses in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. We have other studies from at least 3 different groups that do find them. And a very active effort is underway now, organized by the NIH and FDA, to try to figure out why is this. Are the laboratories doing the testing somewhat differently? Are the patients that they're studying actually different from one another, even though they all seem to meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome? So I figure it'll be 6 to 12 months before there'll be clarity on this. And right now, I think the jury is out. So to give you my answers at this point in time, based on insufficient evidence to these questions, are XMRV and the polytropic MLVs real? Well, yes, they certainly are. They're very real viruses. Can they infect humans? I believe with XMRV, there have been enough studies since it was first reported about 5 years ago that say, yes, it can infect humans, although I know there are some people who don't think that's been proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. I think the evidence about these polytropic MLVs at this point is uncertain. It remains to be confirmed. As I say, 3 groups have reported it, but other groups have not. Are they associated, these polytropic MLVs and XMRV, are they associated with CFS? I think that remains to be confirmed. And even if it is confirmed, it will still remain uncertain as to whether they are a cause of CFS, because all of us carry within us infectious agents that are there. You can find them. But if we have any illnesses, we can show that they're not causing those illnesses. The fact that an infectious agent is present inside a person is no proof at all that it's causing any problems. And indeed, some infectious agents, most of them bacteria, that live inside us actually do good things for us, not bad things. So what would a strong association between these viruses and CFS mean? It could mean 2 different things. It could mean that it is a cause of CFS, either acting alone or, as I said a while ago, in combination with other viruses that also live within us. That's a possibility, but it's far from having been proved. Or it could be secondary. For example, these MLVs could be carried in very low numbers in many of us. And if a condition like chronic fatigue syndrome were caused by something else entirely, but caused the immune system to be less effective than usual, then these sleeping viruses within us could awaken, and you could measure them, but they wouldn't have anything to do with what was causing the chronic fatigue syndrome. So these viruses, if their association with chronic fatigue syndrome is shown to be real, we still won't know if they are a cause of the illness or just a secondary actor that we can measure but that's not making us sick. So what is my current view about the role of viruses in chronic fatigue syndrome in contrast to my view from more than 20 years ago? It's basically identical. That could mean that I'm just too stubborn to change my mind, or it could mean that I believe over 20 years the evidence increasingly has supported each of these points, and that is what I believe. I think that the evidence has grown that infectious agents can probably trigger and perpetuate chronic fatigue syndrome. To me, the best evidence of that was a very, very good study, a very important study done about 4 years ago, organized by the CDC, but conducted in a small town in Australia, where it was a small rural community surrounded by not much in the way of civilization, and basically all of the medical conditions and medical care that people from that town got, they got in a very small community of doctors, one hospital, one laboratory, etc. So you could really measure every single instance of an illness in that community over several years. And they measured the new infection with 3 different infectious agents. And they found that over the course of the next year, as people had been acutely infected with these agents, within the first year, about 11% went on to develop chronic fatigue syndrome. This was, in my judgment, the first really careful, what's called prospective study, where you study people at the moment they've been infected with a new kind of infectious agent and follow what happens to them. If chronic fatigue syndrome is triggered by infection, you would expect to see that some of these people would develop chronic fatigue syndrome, and as I say, they showed that 11% of them did. Most of the agents that I showed you earlier are of the type that cannot be fully eradicated by the immune system, although perhaps one of them that's not true. There's now solid evidence that CFS can follow a new infection. That's the study I just mentioned. And I would say it's possible that in this illness, different infectious agents interact to cause symptoms. I still think that's a very real and attractive hypothesis, and studies should be focusing on that, particularly infections that involve the brain directly. So in closing, as I think back on what for me has been sort of a 25-year involvement in taking care of patients with this illness and in studying what's causing the illness, seems to me that what we have learned over 25 years has been a lot, even though we still don't have lots of fundamental answers, like a perfect diagnostic test, or even better, a perfect treatment. But whereas 25 years ago, there was really no evidence of what was causing these symptoms, or that there was anything objective wrong in the body of people with this illness. That was not clear 25 years ago. I think there's now abundant evidence that there are a lot of things that are wrong. And the trick is to try to tie them all together, all those things, and figure out how one cause or one related group of causes could explain all these different abnormalities that I've very quickly summarized. That, for me, is the research agenda for any of us involved in studying this illness for the next several decades. And hopefully we'll make fundamental progress more rapidly now than has been true over the last 25 years. So thanks very much, and I'm open to questions. Kim?
Thank you, Tony. That was brilliant, as always. I'm going to go ahead and take back the screen. And 1 second. Okay. We'll put your nice picture up instead of a dark black screen. Do you have time for a couple of questions? I know we've gone over time, but we still have 382 people listening in, believe it or not.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with one that has come in during the program that was raised by your discussion of Borna, Parvo, and murine leukemia viruses. People are very concerned about the idea that these might be transmitted from animals to humans. Do you have any thoughts on whether that has been shown or what we need to do in order to understand that better?
Well, I think just talking about the murine leukemia viruses, if it becomes solidly established that these viruses are present in humans, that it's not some laboratory error that has produced the positive results, if that becomes established, then I think ipso facto, it means that these viruses, which we know do have the capability to infect mice, have mutated in such a way that they can infect human beings. That doesn't mean, though, that they're making us sick. Certainly doesn't mean that they're causing any particular kinds of illnesses in us, like the illnesses that they may be able to cause in mice.
Okay. And along those same lines, because of the name murine leukemia viruses, many people have been concerned that if they would test positive for XMRV or these MLVs, that means they have leukemia as well.
Right.
So clear that up, that would be helpful.
Well, you should, it does not mean that. In fact, I have been seeing patients with chronic fatigue syndrome for a quarter century, and not a single patient has ever developed leukemia. Because a virus is able to cause a particular disease in an animal, in one type of animal, doesn't mean that that same virus, even if it's able to infect another animal, will cause the same disease in that other animal. So, you know, it's unfortunate that the word leukemia is attached to the name of these viruses because, of course, it raises a concern that, oh my goodness, if it is shown these viruses really can infect humans, and if it is shown that I've got one of these viruses, does it mean I'm going to get leukemia? That's obviously a question anyone might ask. But what I'm telling you is that I have seen no association between chronic fatigue syndrome, whatever its cause, and leukemia in many, many years of seeing patients with that illness.
Good, that's helpful. And along a similar line, the term infectious agent often leads people to believe they are infectious. So if you could distinguish between infectious conditions and contagious conditions, or infectious agents and contagious conditions, just in general terms, that would be helpful.
Okay. It is an important distinction. Some infectious agents are real easy to pass from, if they involve humans, from one person to another. Other infectious agents are real hard to pass from one human being to another. And so just and as I've said several times during this last hour, all of us are infected with various viruses and bacteria and other kinds of infectious agents for virtually all of our lives. But most of the time, we don't pass those infectious agents on to other people, and we're not made sick by them, and when and if we do pass them to other people, the other people are not made sick by them. So it's, yes, any infectious agent, there's the risk that it might be transmitted to someone else, but with many kinds of infections, it fortunately is very hard for them to be passed from one person to another.
Good. I'm just clicking through. There's been a lot of questions added to the queue here. You talked about several different agents that had been studied and associated with CFS, and I'm looking back through here. What about a couple of things that didn't come up? Hepatitis B. Let's see. There's another one here. Things like flu shots and the regular flu virus, H1N1.
Okay. It is true that hepatitis B virus and hepatitis C virus, chronic infection, often produces a fair amount of fatigue, but there's been no study that I'm aware of that shows either of those two kinds of hepatitis virus are causes of chronic fatigue syndrome. Flu shots are killed virus, and what I think I have seen is that there may be a tendency for people following a flu shot to have a flare-up in symptoms and in redness and soreness in the part of the muscle that was injected for a day or two. But I've never seen a case of chronic fatigue syndrome that began in association with the flu shot. The regular, and I've never seen a case of chronic fatigue syndrome that was triggered by a new infection with the regular flu virus. And maybe the reason is that the regular flu virus is one of those viruses, fortunately, that the immune system seems able to completely eradicate from the body following the initial infection. So when you get better from the flu, it's because all of the virus is gone from your body.
Good. Okay. And I'm going to ask just one more. Well, actually, there are several questions here about testing that people should have done at a clinical level for either the purposes of establishing chronic or acute infections and related therapies, or for things like disability and other legal matters that often come up as a consequence of CFS. Do you have any general caveats about either of those things, Tony?
Would you rephrase that question, Kim? I wasn't sure I understood.
The question has come in a number of different contexts about what kind of testing for chronic or acute infections people should seek from their physician, either to establish a basis for therapy or for things like disability and other legal issues that may arise.
Right. Well, I don't think any standard laboratory tests are useful for that, because there is not yet any diagnostic test that says with high certainty you have chronic fatigue syndrome. If there were such a test, that would be the test I would recommend. So what I think is more important is for patients with chronic fatigue syndrome who are seeking disability to seek an assessment of their functional capacity by people who do this kind of testing. How much endurance do they have, both physical and mental endurance? What are they capable physically and mentally of doing? Because that's what really defines whether someone is going to be disabled. And since we have no diagnostic test for CFS itself, I think the best kind of testing for disability is testing that measures that kind of functional capability.
Great, that's very helpful. And a lot of these questions are very, very specific to certain slides you showed, or different immune markers or neuroendocrine markers. So I think we're not going to be able to get to those today. And then some questions about the more recent research and topics that were covered last week at the first International XMRV workshop, which unfortunately Dr. Komaroff was not present for, but Suzanne Vernon and I were, and we are madly working on a summary of that conference to share. So we will put a link out to those of you who participated in today's webinar when that is up on our website, so that you have kind of the latest snapshot of what the XMRV MLV research looks like in both chronic fatigue syndrome and prostate cancer and other conditions for which there was some data presented. And I think we should probably wrap up at this point to be sensitive and respectful of your schedule, Tony, and also the endurance levels of our participants today. But I want to take just a second to let folks know about the next two webinars in our series. The one on October 5th actually is about some of the research that the association has funded, and Suzanne Vernon will lead a discussion with Gordon Broderick, Kathy Light, and Daikoma Shungu. And Dr. Komaroff showed two slides, one from Dr. Light's group, that was the one with the bar graphs, the 3 bar graphs, and Daikoma Shungu has done the work on lactate in the brain. So we got several questions about that. So if you're interested in those two studies, or either one of those studies, please join us on October 5th for that. And you can hear directly from Dr. Light and Dr. Shungu. And then other people have written in about various overlapping conditions and whether some of the research findings that you had mentioned will also apply to things like fibromyalgia, multiple chemical sensitivities, orthostatic intolerance. And we'll have Dr. Morris Papernick with us on October 21st to give an overview of comorbid conditions that include those topics and several other commonly coexisting conditions with CFS. So I hope that you guys will join us for those two webinars, and we'll provide links to these and other resources on our website in a follow-up email that you'll receive in the next day or two. And just again, the program has been recorded. We'll make the slides available as well on our website, and you can find all of that information here as well as from our home page, which is a little bit easier to remember the URL for. And a reminder about our Solve CFS Biobank. Several people indicated an interest and a willingness to participate in research, and the biobank is a great way to get involved without having to leave home and travel to a specialist office maybe across the country or across the world, since we've got people from Korea and Germany and Norway on the phone today. So we'll also make sure you've got a link to that material as well. And again, I'd just like to thank you, Tony, for spending your early afternoon with us today and navigating this kind of crazy technology. And hopefully terribly awful once we got past some initial audio problems we had.
First 5 minutes, but after that, you know, anyone who likes to hear himself talk, you know, good. And thank you for the invitation. I hope people have found it helpful.
many, many comments about how easy it was to follow and understand, even for folks who don't have a science background. So as always, a great job, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day or evening, depending on which coast you're on. Thanks much.